Pumpkins! The week before Thanksgiving, Canadian Thanksgiving that is, we stopped at a country market. I picked up 3 baking pumpkins for $1 each. That's a really good price, and they're pretty big too, about 4 pounds each. So I thought this would be a good opportunity to make pumpkin pie from scratch. After donning my bacon apron, I preheated the oven to 350 degrees Fahrenheit. The first step is to cut up the pumpkin. As you can see, I've underestimated the toughness of the pumpkin skin. And I didn't sharpen that knife beforehand. The weird part is that if I was carving a jack-o'-lantern, I'd have no problem cutting into it. While slicing up the pumpkin, I discovered just how creaky our IKEA butcher's cart is. I also kept finding these oddly shaped pieces of gray plastic on the floor. It turns out they were pieces of the cart's casters, and they had completely disintegrated. Once the pumpkin is cut up, remove the seeds and pulp. I cut the pieces smaller just to make them easier to handle, and they'll lie flatter on the pan, which might make them cook more evenly, but that's just me thinking. Some recipes say to place dabs of butter on the pumpkin, but since this is going to be used for a pie with lots of other ingredients, I don't think that's necessary. You can add a little water to the pan, in which case you'll want to use something deeper, but I think I'll get away with it this time. And they go into the oven for 45 minutes at 350. While the pumpkin is cooking, I'll make the dough for the crust. I use a simple recipe for the crust: flour, salt, shortening, and water. I've included the recipe for this pastry and the filling in the description of this video. Place 1 cup of flour in a large mixing bowl. There's no need to sift it. The wax paper is for later. Add 1/4 teaspoon of salt and mix it with the flour. Then add 1/3 of a cup and 1 tablespoon of shortening. But you don't have to be that precise. Butter or lard can be substituted for the shortening. Butter does make it a bit tastier, like a Pillsbury crescent roll. If you choose to use lard, don't tell your friends, no matter how much they compliment the crust. People get a little weird with respect to lard. Using a pastry cutter, or if you don't have one, you can use 2 knives, mix the shortening with flour until the pieces are no larger than peas. Then add 3 tablespoons of cold water, 1 at a time, and mixing with a pair of forks between each spoonful. I usually add an extra bit of water, less than a teaspoon, because I like working with a little wetter dough. Use the amount of water that works best for you. Form the dough into a ball or puck, wrap it in wax paper, and place it in the fridge. We'll come back to it later. Once the pumpkin is cooked, it's time to puree it. Before we puree, we need to remove the skin. I also trimmed off any parts that had dried out, some at the edges and where it was cut thin. The next step is to puree the pumpkin. I'll be using a food processor to do this. Normally, I would have just used a potato masher, and I would have been happy with the results. And a potato masher is easier to clean than a food processor, which only adds to its appeal. But there's a lot of pumpkin, and the food processor should be faster, even if it needs a little help now and then. And a food processor is more impressive than a potato masher. Even after pureeing, I still found some stringy parts. They're actually quite soft, and since they're going to be recooked as pie, they won't matter. After Halloween, I cooked up my other pumpkins. This time I added water to the pan. The first pumpkin I added just a little water, and the results were pretty much the same as adding no water. The second one, I added even more water to it. It did puree very nicely, but is extremely mushy. And there you have it, pureed pumpkin. More than enough for one pie, even the big one I'm going to make. Now we can get down to the business of mixing the pie filling. Pumpkin is great, but it's the sugar and spices that put it over the top. I put 3 cups of pumpkin into a mixing bowl. I placed the remainder in a Ziploc bag, which I threw in the freezer. Then I mix in 2/3 of a cup of brown sugar and 2/3 of a cup of white sugar. The original recipe called for 1 cup of sugar each. In fact, I put a little bit less than 2/3 of a cup of each in. I think you could cut the sugar down to half a cup each and not notice the difference. Don't forget to periodically scrape off the mixing blades and sides of the bowl. After mixing in the sugar, you can see how much liquid has been drawn from the pumpkin. Next, I add even more sugar in the form of 2 tablespoons of molasses. The molasses does add a nice flavor, and it makes for a darker final product. Then I add 1/4 teaspoon of ground cloves. I usually grind them myself, and it ends up being a generous 1/4 teaspoon. Then I add 3 tablespoons of cinnamon. I nearly added 6. I was using the wrong measuring spoon. Thankfully, I caught myself at 4. I don't think an extra teaspoon will be much of a problem. Then 2 teaspoons of ginger, or in my case, whatever I could scrape out of the jar. A teaspoon of salt, no screw-ups this time. Then 4 eggs, slightly beaten. And finally 2 cups of milk. But you can also use heavy cream, aka whipping cream, with a whopping 32% fat content. The original recipe called for scalded milk, but I can never taste the difference. You can even add a couple tablespoons of brandy or rum at this point. Me? I'm sticking to 2%. I know my limits. The next step is to roll out the pastry. But before I start that, I'll set the oven to preheat to 425. And now to roll out the pie crust. I use a pastry cloth when rolling out the dough. Sprinkle it with flour to keep the dough from sticking. I also sprinkle flour on the dough as well. Roll out from the center to the edge, turning the pastry in order to get a circle. Sometimes I get more of a square, despite my best efforts. And try to make it a consistent thickness. I did pretty good in this one. Make sure the pastry is slightly larger than the pie pan. I'm using a large 9-inch by 1 3/4-inch deep Pyrex dish. Pyrex, or any glass or ceramic dish, distributes the heat more evenly than a metal pan. This allows the pie to cook more evenly as well. Fold the pastry into quarters so you can center it in the pan easily. Trim the dough so that a 1-inch brim extends around the top of the plate. I brush the underside of the brim with water, then I fold it back on itself, pinching so it forms a ridge. Tidy up the edge, then crimp it. As you can see, I don't get too fussy. Now it's time to bring it all together. Just take the filling and pour it in. I placed the leftover filling in the fridge with plans to make a tart. Then I forgot about it. And voila! Then I placed the pie in the preheated oven. Check it after 40 minutes. When I checked this pie, it was getting close. I left it in for another 10 minutes, but with the oven set at 350, and that finished it off nicely. While it's cooking, I'll show you the book the recipe came from. It's my mom's old, well-thumbed 1946 Canadian edition of the Boston Cooking School cookbook by Fannie Farmer. This was one of the first cookbooks to provide proper instructions and measurements. Before then, recipes could be rather vague. It's still available in reprints today, and following the recipes will result in tasty meals. It's all that lard and bacon fat the Victorians used. And here's the final pie. Letting it sit overnight will allow the flavors to develop. And the proof of the pie is in its taste.
Delicious.
Oh, actually, I missed some here.
That's so good, YouTube community.
Trust me, he's sincere.